Is belief the enemy of faith? UUA President Peter Morales asserts that belief is the enemy of faith. These words have deep resonance within our denomination and in my particular personal spirituality. I would not be standing here today in the pulpit of a UU church if these words were not true for me. Though I was raised a devout Episcopalian, catechized, confirmed, by my teenage years I could no longer say the Apostles' and Nicene creeds with a straight face. Though I reluctantly agreed to be married in the Episcopal Church in my childhood at age 21, I was churchless by my 20s. By 1976, I was a young lawyer in Charleston, South Carolina, living across the street from the Unitarian Church, the oldest in the South. I was playing auto harp with my young toddler in the courtyard when somebody came by and said, "That sounds nice. Would I come play in the church next Sunday?" I walked in. I saw the stained glass, the organ, the soaring Gothic arches, and suddenly I missed church. But I also remembered why I could no longer support the Episcopal Church. I asked the person showing around me what you had to believe to belong here. She said, "We accept people of all religious beliefs." I was set. As I settled into an active lay membership there, I discovered that my experience in a way mirrors the history of that church. What became the Unitarian Church of Charleston started as the overflow chapel of a popular church 2 streets away, the Independent Church, now known as Circular Congregational. By the early 19th century, this was a church that was not only Congregationalist, but had a lot of free thinkers in it. Every Sunday morning, they had separate but identical services in the 2 chapels, two blocks apart. About 1816, the senior pastor fell ill, and the congregation asked a newly minted Presbyterian preacher named Anthony Forster to fill in for a few weeks. Forster was from North Carolina, and he had recently married a girl from Raleigh. His new father-in-law was a disciple of Joseph Priestley, the great amateur scientist and British Unitarian. So Forster, the young Calvinist son-in-law, embarks on a reading of Priestley to try to convert his new father-in-law to the true faith, to show the error of his ways, but lo and behold, became himself convinced that Priestley was right. He kept his theological views to himself during his first period preaching to the Congregationalists in Charleston, and he became very popular with the congregation. And when the regular minister retired or died, I forget which, there was a movement to call young Forster as the church's minister. However, some of the elders of the congregation became suspicious of Forster's orthodoxy, and they insisted that before he could be called as minister, he had to sign the Westminster Confession of Faith, a kind of creedal test at the time. Forster responded with a letter in which he explained why creeds were the enemy of faith. I wish I could find that letter. It's referred to in other documents, but I've never found it. But as a result of Forster's refusal to sign the Westminster Confession, the Independent Church refused to call him as minister, but there was a big reaction against this from his supporters, and the church split in 2, with the Orthodox staying on Meeting Street and the Liberals taking what had been the Overflow building on Archdale. Thus, the Unitarian Church in Charleston came into existence out of a suspicion of creeds. Anthony Forster died shortly after establishing the Charleston Church as a Unitarian entity, but I think you would probably agree with Peter Morales' recent words. I am now convinced that belief, in the way we usually use the word, is actually the enemy of faith, religion, and spirituality. When we dwell on beliefs, we ask all the wrong questions. My faith is much more about what I love than what I think. What is the difference between faith and belief? Belief is cognitive. It arises from our quest for meaning, and it searches for an account of things so that we can explain them to ourselves. How did it come to be that birds fly, that women have pains in giving birth, that people die, that storms arise. Faith is more like trust than it is like belief. When I get on an airplane to fly somewhere, I don't go asking whether the ground crew has done all its work to prepare the huge machine to take my body through the air at several hundred miles per hour. I don't ask whether the pilot is qualified. I trust that these things are taken care of. By my act of boarding the plane, I express my faith that the system set up to ensure airline safety will work this time for me. Perhaps a clearer example of the difference between belief and faith is our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. I've often said that this is an article of faith with me, not an article of belief. I know some absolute scoundrels from the pages of history, have encountered a few of them in my daily life, and have represented more in my law practice. My experience of reprehensible people who do reprehensible things, child molesters, murderers, architects of genocide, is always threatening my commitment to the first principle. But I hold to that principle as a matter of faith, not as a matter of belief. I wish to live in a world where everyone accords to everyone else inherent worth and dignity. And the only way I can help to live in such a world is to practice these values myself. So I choose to treat everyone, even the worst among us, as having inherent worth and dignity. It is my leap of faith, if you will. Many of us today will not call ourselves Christians, but both of our constituent denominations came out of Christianity, and Western thought is heavily influenced by Christian doctrine. Orthodox Christian doctrine is based on belief. Many Christians today would say that the essence of the Christian religion is contained in one biblical verse, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everybody that believed in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Belief. The gates of eternal life in Orthodox thinking are open only to those who believe in Jesus. What does it mean to believe in Jesus? That question has a different answer at different points of development of Christianity. But by the time the Gospel of John came along, it was to believe that Jesus was divine, the Son of God. Now this was something new. Christianity grows out of Judaism, but there's nothing like this belief requirement in Judaism. To be a good Jew, you need to be loyal to God, to keep the commandments, and to be circumcised. But you don't have to believe any particular thing about God. I think this belief requirement came late into Christianity. I don't think it was there in the beginning. I don't think it was preached by Jesus himself. In fact, Jesus reached out to Gentiles, tax collectors, prostitutes. Why do I think this requirement of belief arose late in Christianity? Remember that all four of the Gospels in the New Testament were written after the collapse of the Jewish revolt against Rome in 58 to 60 of the first century. Mark was first, with Matthew and Luke maybe a decade later, and John coming in late in the first century. But these accounts, first committed to writing 3 decades or more after Jesus' death, were probably based on earlier texts which were written down closer to the time of Jesus' ministry. Scholars point to 2 texts which may give us an earlier account of Jesus. The first is the text the scholars call Q, which is embedded in the texts of Matthew and Luke. The second is the Gospel of Thomas, a Gnostic text from possibly early in the first century. Both Q and Thomas are not narratives of Jesus' life, but collections of sayings and short stories. More importantly, they don't have anything about Jesus being divine or requiring belief in this divine Jesus as a key to entering eternal life. The absence of these ideas in these earlier texts gives rise to my feeling that Jesus did not require belief as a condition of salvation. A few years ago, New Testament scholar Elaine Pagels wrote a provocative book called Beyond Belief, which argues that the Gospel of Thomas existed before the canonical Gospel of John was written, and that John was written as a refutation of Thomas. In Thomas, Jesus offers salvation to everyone and says that everyone has a spark of divinity. sort of like Emerson. In John, only Jesus is divine, and you don't get to heaven unless you believe in Jesus. Pagel's idea was that John was written to refute Thomas, gets some support from the fact that Thomas appears as a character in John's Gospel, where Thomas the disciple is made into a buffoon, doubting Thomas, because he does not believe in Jesus' resurrection. In the 2nd century, the Christian church clamped down on heretical views and texts, and most copies of the Gospel of Thomas were destroyed. The noose tightened further in 325, when Constantine decided to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. He called a great meeting at Nicaea to have the bishops spell out exactly what Christians did believe in. And the result was the Nicene Creed. That creed which was to separate me from the faith of my childhood and my young adult years, and to lead me in a negative way to Unitarian Universalism. But there is a lot of Jesus that I value. But it is largely in the words that he taught and the values he lived by, not his status as the exclusive Son of God, nor his supposed birth from a virgin. I was at a Episcopal service earlier this week. Matt McDowell was served on the Barnesville County Human Rights Commission with me. He was an Episcopal minister adjunct at the church in Harwichport. And he died suddenly. There was this memorial service, which was over 2 hours long. In the course of it, there was a Eucharist as well, offered supposedly to everybody that was there. I was there as a visiting clergy, so I had on my robe. But we came to this point, before you got to the Eucharist, you had the creed. And I looked down there, and there was that creed. It's still the same creed. And I still have the same problems with it. And I said to myself, here I am in my robe, sitting in the clergy section. Do I say the creed, one, and if I don't say the creed, do I take communion? I decided to split the baby. I would not say the creed, but I would take communion. And everybody seemed to be okay with that. But that creed doesn't describe Jesus. It doesn't say anything about what Jesus taught. It has all of these assertions about his status, his theological status, but it does not come to grips with the Good Samaritan story, the Sermon on the Mount, or any of the things that I consider most important about Jesus. Ronald Dworkin was a legal philosopher who recently died, but his last book was about religion. He was an atheist, but unlike the new atheists such as Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett, he had a deep respect for religion. His book is called Religion Without God. He summarizes its main idea in these words. The theme of this book is that religion is deeper than God. Religion is a deep, distinct, and comprehensive worldview. It holds that an inherent objective value permeates everything, that the universe and its creatures are all inspiring, that human life has purpose and the universe order. A belief in God is only one possible manifestation or consequence of that worldview. This idea that religion is larger than, deeper than, and different from a belief in God is elaborated in a recent book on religion by religious scholar James P. Carse entitled The Religious Case Against Belief. Belief, Carse tells us, is a system for exploiting the world, a system for explaining the world. It can be in a religion or outside of it. A religion, by contrast, is something that has endured over time. It is a communitas, a collection of people that persists over and against the rest of the world. Here's a quote. Belief systems offer a rational and consistent view of everything, whether it should be how one should parent a child, what is to be taught in schools, or which enemies are most threatening. They also have a developed sense of history in which both the past and the future are unambiguously delineated. Religions are nothing of the kind. They are marbled with inconsistency, paradox, and contradiction. Rationality and truth seem to have no influence on the durability of a tradition. Its communitas, especially in its most vital expression, adheres to no particular pattern or ideology. There's no knowing in advance what path it will take. However learned one might be in the study of the gospel, nothing could be found in them that would presage the building of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the founding of Oxford University, or the Holy Roman Empire. Unquote. Our own New Youth thinker Sophia Lyon-Foss says that some beliefs are like walled gardens. Belief systems tend to be exclusive, to define themselves against other systems. Liberals and moderates in this country today find themselves scratching their heads at the apparent irrationality of the Tea Party and its representatives in Congress who have brought the country to the brink of economic catastrophe over their opposition to the Affordable Care Act and other aspects of the current political scene. We don't understand the passion that would drive people to be so self-destructive. But there is a belief system behind it, one which defines itself in contrast to policies of the current administration. And while this belief system does not persuade the country at large, it is persuasive in certain electoral districts, and thus this type of political extremism appears to be a fact of life for some time to come. It's something we need to wrap our minds around. Back to Dr. Carstow. He states the central argument of his book as follows. The central argument of this book is that there is a religious case to be made against belief. Belief has been defined here as the place where we stop our thinking. When we speak of defending our beliefs, we obviously take them to be positions that will hold against all challenges. The assumption is that we're certain about the truth of our beliefs and that we are in hostile relation to non-believers. If there's a religious case to be made against beliefs so defined, we must clarify what is meant by religious. Definitions of religion are famously difficult to make. Scholars have, in fact, largely abandoned the effort to do so. What can be said about the great religions is that there's no human institution that remotely equals their longevity, especially when we consider that they have also preserved their unity as a people who recognize themselves as a people. The heart of the collective life of these religions, or communitas, is unique to each. One religion cannot be understood in terms of another, or for that matter in terms of anything else. Their ongoing dynamism consists in the fact that they have not been able to clarify for themselves what their identity consists of. That is, they are animated by an ignorance that remains ignorance, regardless of the effort to replace it with knowledge or with belief. Unquote. In Carson's view, this term ignorance, is central. Earlier in the book, he identifies three types of ignorance. Ordinary ignorance, where we're simply unaware of a fact. Willful ignorance, where we deliberately ignore something. And higher ignorance, which is something learned after long reflection and representing a basic understanding that there are essential truths that are unknowable. Quote, ignorance thus described can be understood as a process of awakening or being awakened. The more we are aware of the limits of our knowledge, the more awake we are to the world's enormous varieties. At the risk of stretching the metaphor too far, ordinary ignorance is a sleep that does not know itself as asleep. The willfully ignorant are in a state of wakefulness, but one that feigns sleep, intentionally restricting the horizon of their daylight world. The learned ignorant are awake and know they are awake, but also know they will never succeed in altogether dispelling the unwanted drowsiness. Unquote. This learned ignorance is central to religion over time. It allows a religion to persist because there is at the core something which cannot be explained in words. The religious enterprise is all about words. Words of praise and words of comfort and words of confession, as well as words of explanation, but the words cannot explain the unknowables at the core of each of the great religions. True faith recognizes that there is something outside of ourselves that we will never be able to grasp in words, and that our understanding of it is always evolving. Creeds, which are collections of words, are not the core of religion, and a religion which allows itself to be reduced to a creed is dead. It is the strength of Unitarian Universalism that it recognizes this mystery at the core. It does not try to explain it, nor does it try to persuade anyone that your beliefs are wrong and mine are right. What we have faith in is the process of inquiry, the quest of truth, and the importance of acceptance of one another in the face of our differences of opinion. In this sense, belief is truly the enemy of faith. Amen.